The morning my mother unplugged my computer, I had 17 browser tabs open, a deadline in 4 hours, and a presentation that was going to close the biggest deal of my career. I remember the exact second it happened. The screen went black. Not a flicker, not a glitch, not a warning, just black. That absolute, immediate black that happens when power is cut at the source. And in that horrible silence that followed, that half second where your brain refuses to accept what just happened, I heard the sound of footsteps on my hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate, like she wanted me to hear them coming. And then her voice. "This is ridiculous, Danielle. You sit in this little room all day like the world revolves around you." I turned around slowly, and there she was. My mother, Margaret Louise Carter, 61 years old, standing in the doorway of my home office in the beige cardigan she always wore when she was about to say something she'd already decided couldn't be argued with. The power cord was dangling from her hand. She'd pulled it clean out of the wall, like she owned the wall, like she owned the room, like she owned me. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel panic about my deadline, though the deadline was very real and very close. What I felt was something much quieter than either of those things, something that had been building for months, maybe years, finally making itself known, like a pressure valve that has been holding and holding and holding, and then the dial tips one final degree past its limit. I felt done. Not done in a dramatic way, not done in a screaming, throwing things, storming out of the house way. Done the way you feel when you've been walking a very long road and you finally see the end of it, and you realize, oh, I've been walking toward this the whole time. I stood up from my chair. I walked to the wall. I took the cord gently from my mother. She was so surprised she didn't even resist, and I plugged it back in. I stood there, and I watched the screen come back to life, everything loading, my presentation right where I left it. And then I sat back down, and I pulled up my email, and I opened a draft that had been sitting in my drafts folder for 11 days. I read it one final time, and I hit send. My mother was still standing in the doorway. She said, "Danielle, are you even listening to me? Your sister needs you. You need to quit this job and go take care of those children. She can't keep doing this alone." And I turned around in my chair to face her, and I said, very calmly, very clearly, "I can't do that, Mom. But what I just did, I just emailed Brandon the DNA results that proved those triplets belonged to his boss." There was a moment. One of those moments that seems to stretch longer than time actually allows, where you can see every detail, the light through the window, the dust motes floating in it, the blue of my mother's eyes going from confident to confused to something I don't have a word for. And then the coffee cup, the ceramic mug she'd been holding since she walked through my front door, the one that said "World's Best Grandma" that Tiffany had given her 2 Christmases ago, slipped right out of her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, and I didn't move to clean it up. That moment, that one moment, was the end of something that had been a long time dying, and the beginning of something I hadn't yet had the language to name. But to understand why I hit send, you have to understand everything that led me there. You have to understand the family I was born into, the role I'd been assigned before I was old enough to question it, and the slow, quiet accumulation of moments that turn a woman who always says yes into a woman who finally says enough. So let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning. My name is Danielle Carter Marsh. I'm 34 years old. I'm a senior data analyst at a remote consulting firm. I own my home, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio that I renovated slowly and carefully and with great love over the past 4 years. I have a rescue dog named Biscuit, who is, without question, the best decision I have ever made. I drink my coffee black. I run 3 miles every other morning. I keep a very organized kitchen and a very disorganized bookshelf, and I have made peace with that contradiction. By most external measures, I have a good life. a stable life, a life I built myself, from scratch, without anyone handing me anything. And for most of my adult life, I have been the invisible daughter. Not the favorite, not the cautionary tale, not the black sheep or the golden child, or any of the roles that get talked about at family dinners. Just invisible. The one who handled things. The one who showed up when things needed doing. The one my mother called when a problem needed solving and forgot about the moment the problem was gone. I'm done being invisible, and I'm going to tell you everything. Let me paint you a picture of the Carter family, because context is everything, and I mean everything. You cannot understand a single decision I made, not the waiting, not the email, not any of it, without understanding where I came from. My mother, Margaret Louise Carter, grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, small town, the kind of place where everyone knows which family lives in which house and has an opinion about both. My grandmother was a churchwoman, my grandfather ran a hardware store, and my mother understood at a very fundamental level that appearances were the only currency that really mattered. In Millbrook, beauty was power, charm opened doors, and the woman who could walk into a room and make it stop, that was the woman worth knowing. My mother was that woman. In her youth, by all accounts, she was striking. Dark hair, good cheekbones, the kind of presence that made people sit up a little straighter. She married my father, Robert Carter, when she was 23. He was 26, steady and quiet, and utterly devoted to her. And she began building the family she'd always envisioned. She had Tiffany first. Brandon initiated divorce proceedings formally 8 weeks after the email. He is seeking primary physical custody of the triplets, and from what I understand, the case is not uncomplicated. Custody cases involving questions of paternity are rarely straightforward, and I will not pretend to know how it will resolve. What I know is that Brandon shows up. Every day, in every way, he shows up for those kids. He has taken them to their pediatric appointments and their toddler music classes and the park every Saturday morning without exception. He is building something with them, something steady, something real, and I believe in his ability to do that regardless of how the court proceedings go. Tiffany and I have not spoken since the night she called me screaming. I have tried, twice, to reach out, not to relitigate anything, not to be right at her, not to demand acknowledgement, just to say, I'm still here. I still love your children. The door is open if you want it open. Both times, she didn't respond. I'm leaving the door open anyway. My mother and I talk on the phone every Sunday. It was her idea, which surprised me enough that I agreed before I'd fully processed it. The calls are not easy. We don't have the vocabulary for the kind of conversation we probably need to have, but there's something in them that wasn't in our relationship before, a kind of careful, effortful honesty that feels like the very beginning of something. I don't know what it's the beginning of. I'm trying to approach it with curiosity rather than expectation. She said something to me 2 Sundays ago that I've been turning over in my mind since. She said, "Your father would have done exactly what you did." And I said, "I know, Mom. That's why I did it." And then we talked about something else and the moment passed, but I held on to it. It has been 4 months since I hit send. Brandon has the triplets this weekend. I know because he texted me on Friday, "Kids are here. Amelia wants to know if Aunt Danny is coming." I'll drive down tomorrow. I'll bring the dinosaur book I ordered for Amelia, the one about Spinosaurus specifically because she mentioned him 3 separate times at the last visit, and I took notes. I'll bring the puzzle Cora liked when I showed her one on my phone. I'll bring Liam absolutely nothing because Liam has just discovered that wrapping paper is the most interesting thing in the world, and the toy inside it is frankly an inconvenience. I'm going to sit on Brandon's living room floor, and I'm going to be present for those kids in whatever way they need for as long as they'll let me. That's not going to change. It has never been contingent on the adults around them behaving well, and it never will be. My job is fine. My career is more than fine. That deal I closed the morning my mother unplugged my computer led to a second contract with the same client, and my director wants to talk about the partnership track in earnest now. I am building something. slowly, steadily, on my own terms, the way I've always built things. My house is still mine, the garden is still alive, barely, but alive. Biscuit is getting gray around his muzzle, and I refuse to accept it. And me. I want to talk about me for a moment. I spent a lot of my life believing that my role in this family was a supporting one, not just accepting it, believing it, internalizing it in the way you internalize things that have been told to you long enough that they start to feel like truth. I believed that Tiffany needed to be the main character, and I needed to make space for her to be that. I believed that family meant absorbing what was asked of you, quietly and without complaint, because that's what love looked like. I don't believe that anymore. I believe love looks like honesty. I believe love looks like showing up for people, genuinely, fully, in ways that sometimes cost you something. I believe love looks like those three little faces on a Sunday afternoon, when they don't know you're watching them, when they're just being exactly what they are. I believe love looks like plugging the cord back in. I am not the invisible daughter anymore. I'm not sure I was ever really invisible. I think I was just performing invisibility because someone had handed me that role and I didn't yet understand I was allowed to put it down. I put it down. And when I did, I didn't drift. I didn't disappear. I didn't become the villain in someone else's story, though I know that in certain versions of this story, being told in certain rooms, I am exactly that. I found out where I actually stand, what I'm actually made of, what I'm willing to do for the people I love, and what I'm no longer willing to be used for in the name of love. There's a version of this story where I'm the woman who destroyed a family, but I didn't build that lie. I didn't maintain it. I didn't ask anyone to live inside it. I just stopped being the person who enabled it to continue, and I would do it again. My name is Danielle Carter Marsh. I'm the steady one, and I'm just getting started. I had been bracing for it, checking my phone every 20 minutes, running through scenarios in my head, trying to prepare for whatever version of this conversation was coming. What I was not prepared for was how quiet he was. He wasn't a man who'd been exploded. He was a man who'd been hollowed out. There is a difference, and you can hear it. Rage takes up space in a voice. What I heard in Brandon's voice was the sound of space collapsing, the sound of an architecture failing. He said, "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I told him. He asked why I waited. I told him the truth. I needed to be certain, and I needed to be certain that I was doing it for the right reasons, for him and for those kids, not for anything else. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Thank you, Danielle." That was it. Just that. I held myself together until I hung up the phone, and then I sat on my kitchen floor and I cried for about 20 minutes. Biscuit came and put his head in my lap, and I held on to him and I just let it happen, because it was sad. Even when something is right, it can be deeply, genuinely sad. And I'm not a person who confuses rightness with painlessness. Tiffany called that night at 9 o'clock, and this was not quiet. She screamed, she cried, she screamed again. She accused me of jealousy, of spending my whole life jealous of everything she had, and this was my way of burning it down because I couldn't build anything comparable of my own. She said I had never supported her. She said I had always been resentful and cold, and this was the proof of it. She said I had destroyed their children's family. I let her say all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not defend. I know from experience that there is no point in arguing with someone in that state. It feeds the fire. It doesn't extinguish it. I waited, and I listened, and I let her exhaust herself. And then, when she was quiet, I said, "Tiffany, I love Amelia, Cora, and Liam. I have loved them since before I even met them, and those kids deserve to grow up in a truth. So does Brandon. What I did for them, not for any other reason." She hung up without responding. My mother called me the following morning. She was calm in the way that comes after a long night of not sleeping. She asked me several practical questions. Had I kept a copy of the document? Had I spoken to anyone else? And I answered them. We didn't discuss feelings. We rarely discuss feelings. But before she hung up, she said something that she clearly found very difficult to say, because she said it quietly and quickly and moved on immediately. You did what you thought was right. From my mother, in this situation, that sentence was a mountain. The 72 hours that followed the email were the most disorienting of my adult life. Not the most painful, I've had painful, not the most dramatic, there was drama to come, but disorienting, yes, because I had pulled a thread and a sweater was unraveling, and I was just standing there watching it happen. Brandon retained legal counsel within the week, quietly, efficiently, without broadcasting. That's Brandon. He processes things internally and then acts decisively. I heard from him only once in those first few weeks, a text that said, "I'm okay, taking care of the kids, we'll be in touch." 6 words of reassurance that cost him something, and I received them as the gift they were. Tiffany, in contrast, was very loud. The story she told, to my mother, to her friends, to anyone who would receive it, was that I had been jealous of her entire life and had seized on a private document to destroy her marriage out of spite and personal inadequacy. She told people I had always resented her. She told people I was unstable. She told one of her friends, who told someone who eventually told me, that I had fabricated the document entirely. That last one was interesting to me, because a person who knows the document is genuine does not tell people it's fabricated. A person who knows the document is genuine tells people it was obtained unethically, or that it's been misinterpreted, or that the context is more complicated. Fabricated is what you say when you're hoping the story will die before anyone investigates. It did not die. Preston Hale resigned from Brandon's company 3 weeks after I sent the email. The official reason cited was personal matters and a desire to pursue other ventures. I know more than that. I will keep what I know private, partly out of respect for people who don't deserve to have their full stories told by someone who was only ever adjacent to them, and partly because some things are better left to the people directly involved. What I'll say is that the resignation was not voluntary in any meaningful sense of that word. My mother, during these weeks, was in a difficult position that I almost felt sorry for her about. She had spent years building a narrative in which Tiffany was the successful daughter and I was the background character. And now the successful daughter's life was in pieces, and the background character had been the one who, well, she had to find a way to revise the story she'd been telling herself. My mother is a proud woman. Revision does not come naturally to her. She called me every few days. The calls were strange. She'd ask practical questions, then veer into almost accusations that she'd quickly pull back from, then land on something almost approaching genuine conversation before retreating again. It was like watching someone try to cross a room on ice. Tiffany moved out of the family home 6 weeks after the email. She moved in with my mother. I want you to sit with the visual of that because it tells you something. My mother, who had pushed me to quit my job and become Tiffany's unpaid childcare provider, now had Tiffany in her guest room. The triplets were there several days a week. My mother was, in effect, providing exactly the support structure she'd been demanding I provide, without the framing of sacrifice she'd been applying to me. And not once did she acknowledge that irony to me directly, though she did stop calling me to tell me I needed to quit my job. I'll count that as something. I noticed that Tiffany had a new perfume, not the one she'd worn for years, the warm amber one I associated completely with her, but something sharper, newer, more carefully chosen. I noticed that she kept her phone face down on every surface, always face down. That's not a habit you develop by accident. That's a habit you develop because you've decided certain things shouldn't be seen. And I noticed, most of all, a name. She mentioned it only once, briefly, casually, in a phone call about something else entirely. She mentioned she was going back to Scottsdale, to that same resort, and she said the name of it in passing. The Hale Summit Resort. And I recognized it. I recognized it because I'd seen it on a brochure in Brandon and Tiffany's home 2 years earlier. I recognized it because I'd heard Brandon mention the name Preston Hale, his boss, his primary investor, the man whose name was on the original capital that built Brandon's company, in relation to that resort. Preston Hale owned it. And that was the moment the pattern shifted from a feeling into something more. I want to be precise about what happened next because I need you to understand that I did not go looking for what I found. I am not a person who investigates other people's lives. I'm not wired that way. I believe in privacy, and I believe in minding my lane, and I believe that relationships, even broken ones, deserve a kind of dignity. But I found it anyway. Tiffany and I share a cloud storage account. We set it up 5 years ago after our father died, when we were scanning old documents and family photos and needed somewhere central to put them. She barely uses it. I use it occasionally for my own files, and it had become, over time, one of those digital spaces you forget exists, like an old email address, like a drawer you don't open. I was searching for a property record, an old estate document I needed for an unrelated matter, and I was scrolling through shared folders I barely recognized anymore, and I found one. A subfolder with a file name that was just numbers. A date. The date was the birthday of the triplets. I don't have a clean explanation for why I clicked on it. I genuinely don't. Maybe it was the fact that the file name was a date at all. Who names a folder with a date unless the date means something specific? Maybe it was the pattern recognition that I'd been running for weeks, finally landing on something. Maybe it was just a hand hovering over a mouse and a finger that moved before the conscious mind issued the instruction. I clicked on it. Inside was a single PDF, a DNA paternity test. I read the header first: lab name, reference number, date of processing, 3 subjects tested, listed by assigned codes, not names, but the birth dates matched exactly. 2 potential fathers listed. The first name, Brandon Thomas Whitfield. The second name, Preston Allen Hale. I read the results section 3 times. Brandon Whitfield was excluded as the biological father of all 3 children. Probability of paternity 0.000%. Preston Hale was confirmed as the biological father of all 3 children. Probability of paternity 99.9998%. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen. I could hear Biscuit breathing in the other room. Outside, a neighbor was mowing their lawn, and the sound of it, that completely ordinary Saturday afternoon sound, felt surreal in a way I couldn't articulate, like the world was still running its regular programming while I sat inside something that had changed shape entirely. I thought about those 3 children: Amelia with her total commitment to dinosaur facts, Cora with her watching eyes and her quiet observations, Liam, who had just started walking and was so pleased with himself about it that he would take 3 steps and then turn around to make sure you'd seen. Those 3 children were growing up inside a lie, and the man raising them, the man who had restructured his entire life to be their father, was building his professional life around the man who had fathered them without his knowledge. I sat with that for 3 weeks. I want you to understand the 3 weeks. I didn't act immediately because acting immediately would have been reckless, and I am not a reckless person. I sat with the weight of it. I verified what I could. The lab name checked out. The document metadata was consistent. There was no indication of alteration. I turned it over and over and over. I thought about every person this would affect. I thought about what it meant to know something and do nothing. I thought about what it meant to know something and act. And then my mother walked into my home office and pulled the cord out of the wall. And I understood with absolute clarity that doing nothing was also a choice, and it was a choice that enabled something I was no longer willing to enable. I plugged the cord back in. I opened the draft. I hit send. I want to walk you through what was in that email because I think it matters. I had written it and rewritten it 9 times over those 3 weeks. I had written versions that were long and explanatory and full of context. I had written one version that was so emotional I deleted it immediately and felt embarrassed even though no one would ever see it. What I finally landed on was simple. Subject line, something you deserve to know. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that I was sending this because I believed he had a right to information that directly affected his life, and that I was sorry this was happening, and that I had thought carefully about whether and how to do this, and that I wanted him to know the decision had not been easy or casual. The second paragraph told him where I had found the document, and that I had not gone looking for it deliberately, and that there was no reason to believe the document was anything other than authentic, but that he should of course seek his own independent verification. The third paragraph said simply, I love those kids. That's not going to change. Whatever you need from me, I'm here. The PDF was attached. I hit send at 10:34 in the morning, and then I turned around to face my mother, and I told her what I'd done. And the coffee cup fell. Now, let me tell you what happened in the room after the cup fell, because I think about it often. My mother didn't scream. She didn't demand I unsend it. She must have understood you can't unsend something, and my mother is, whatever else she is, a practical woman. She stood there in the wreckage of that world's best grandma mug, and she was very still and very quiet for almost a full minute. And then she said, Did you check that the file was accurate? Not, how could you? Not, do you understand what you've done to this family? Did you check? And I thought in that moment about what that question revealed, about what the first response of someone who believes the document is false is, that's not real. The first response of someone who's genuinely shocked is something wordless, probably, something that doesn't compute to language right away. The first response of someone who wonders, even at a low level, if it might be true is, are you sure? I told her yes. I had verified it as thoroughly as I could. She bent down and began picking up the pieces of the broken mug, and she set them on my counter with a kind of deliberate care that I recognized as my mother managing herself. And then she said without looking at me, This is going to be very hard for Tiffany. Not for Brandon, not for those children, for Tiffany. Even now, even in that moment. I said, I know. And she left. I sat back down at my desk. I breathed for a moment, and then I opened my presentation and I finished it and I sent it to my client at 11:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the deadline. The client loved it. We got the deal. Brandon called at 4 in the afternoon.
Danielle. 2 syllables, a lifetime packed inside them. Family helps family. You're not raising children of your own. You have capacity that is being wasted on a job that a computer could probably do. This is about priorities. A job that a computer could probably do. I let that sentence sit in me for a second. Then I told her I'd think about it. I hung up and I filed it firmly in the part of my brain where I kept things that were not going to happen, and I went back to work. But my mother is not a woman who accepts filing. She called again the next week, and the week after. And then Tiffany called, and her voice was doing the soft, tired thing it did when she wanted something and knew that soft and tired was the right key for me specifically. She said she just needed to breathe. She said she had a trip she'd been planning. She said she just needed someone reliable with the kids for a little while. I asked how long. 6 weeks. I asked if Brandon was going with her. Pause. Brandon can't get away. And something in my stomach went very quiet. I want to talk about instinct. I want to talk about it seriously because I think it's one of the most underestimated forms of intelligence that exists. Women are taught from the time we're very small to distrust our own instincts. We're taught to call them paranoia, overthinking, jealousy, making something out of nothing. We're taught that feelings require external verification before they can be acted upon. that we need evidence, proof, receipts before we're allowed to say, something is wrong here. At this point in the story, I had no evidence of anything. I had a sister who wanted to take a 6-week solo trip. Unorthodox, maybe, but not criminal. Not even that unusual given who Tiffany was. But the way she'd paused before she said, "Brandon can't get away," that pause lived in me like a splinter, small and invisible and impossible to stop touching. I said no to the 6 weeks, firmly and clearly, firmer than I'd said anything to my mother or Tiffany in recent memory. I said I could not take unpaid extended leave to provide free childcare, and I would not be quitting my job, and I was happy to help on occasional weekends, but I was not available as a full-time solution. I said it, and I meant it, and I thought, naively, that saying it clearly meant it was finished. It was not finished. Over the following 2 months, my mother escalated in a way that I can only describe as a sustained campaign. She began showing up at my house unannounced. My mother lives 40 minutes away, traditionally far enough that visits were always scheduled. But suddenly, she was just there, on a Tuesday morning, on a Thursday afternoon, in the area, always with coffee from the drive-thru down the road, always settling herself at my kitchen table like she'd been invited. She would sit there and build her case, piece by piece, with the patience of someone who has decided to verdict before the trial begins. She reminded me that I was the capable one, the reliable one, my father's steady one, as if those qualities created an obligation to be used. She reminded me that Tiffany had given the family 3 grandchildren simultaneously. Wasn't that extraordinary? Didn't that sacrifice deserve to be honored and supported? She told me that a good family rallies around its members who are struggling. And once, just once, but I have not forgotten it, she said with the casual precision of someone who doesn't realize they've just drawn blood, "You don't have your own family to worry about, Danielle. You have a simpler situation. That's just the truth." I put my mug down on the counter. I looked at my mother, and I thought about all the things I could say to that sentence. I thought about how not having children doesn't mean my time is unclaimed. I thought about how the absence of one kind of life doesn't create a responsibility to fill someone else's. I thought about asking her whether she'd ever looked at me, really looked at me, and seen a complete person rather than available capacity. I said, "I'll think about it." And I went back to work. But the splinter was deeper now, and I had started paying attention. When I start paying attention, I pay real attention. It's occupational, honestly. I spend my professional life looking at data sets and finding the signal inside the noise, finding the number that's slightly off, the pattern that doesn't behave the way it should, the variable that's being influenced by something the model hasn't accounted for. So I started paying attention to my sister's life the way I'd pay attention to data. I noticed that when I called Tiffany's house in the evenings, she often didn't answer. She'd been home, she'd text me an hour later from the same location, just not answering. I noticed her text responses were always brief, single sentences, quick acknowledgments, where they used to be streams of messages, one thought tumbling into the next, the way Tiffany's mind always worked. I noticed at Easter dinner that Tiffany and Brandon sat at opposite ends of the table. Not in the way couples sometimes do when hosting. That's practical, one at each end. This was different. This was the specific distance of 2 people who have decided not to be near each other and are being polite about it. They spoke to each other twice during the meal. I counted. Once about whether Amelia needed more of the pasta she liked, and once about what time they needed to leave for the drive home.
Back on her feet from what? She's not sick, Mom. She's overwhelmed. She has a husband, she has a part-time nanny, she has a housekeeper who comes twice a week. The nanny quit. Then hire another one. And I think, in some deep and probably unconscious way, my mother looked at Tiffany and saw herself perfected. Everything she had been, refined and amplified. Tiffany had the pale blue eyes that skipped generations. She had naturally blonde hair that fell in waves without trying. She had that laugh. God, that laugh. The kind that makes entire rooms turn to find the source. She was the kind of child that strangers complimented in grocery stores, and my mother accepted those compliments the way you accept applause. 3 years later, she had me. And I came out practical. That's the most honest word I have for it. I looked like my father's side. Dark hair, brown eyes, average height, a face that is perfectly fine and completely forgettable. I was good at school from an early age. I was organized. I was reliable. I was the child who remembered where things were kept and how to read a bus schedule and what time the library closed on Sundays. My mother loved me. I want to say that clearly. I believe she loved me in the way she was capable of loving, which was real love, just delivered through a very particular lens. The lens being, Tiffany was the jewel of this family, and I was the setting, valuable in my function, invisible by design. My father, Robert, was a different story. My father saw me. He was a quiet man. Insurance, baseball, comfortable silences. But when we were together, one-on-one, he had a way of paying attention that made you feel like the only person in any room. He used to call me his steady one. Not in a diminishing way. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. He'd say, "Danny, you're the one I'd want in the foxhole. You'd figure it out." I think about that a lot. He died 6 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden, clean, devastating. He was at work on a Wednesday afternoon, and by Wednesday evening, he was gone. And the grief of that, the specific grief of losing the one person who saw you clearly, is a grief that doesn't fully resolve. You just learn to carry it more gracefully over time. After my father died, my mother stepped into the role of family matriarch with a completeness that I found both impressive and terrifying. She needed to be the center. She needed to be needed. She needed to be the person through whom all family decisions flowed. And Tiffany, beautiful, magnetic Tiffany, gave her the perfect architecture for that. Because by the time we lost my father, Tiffany had already married Brandon Whitfield. And Brandon Whitfield deserves his own paragraph, maybe several. Brandon is the kind of man who arrives somewhere and makes you feel like whatever was happening before he got there was just the warm-up. Genuinely successful. He built a regional logistics company from a startup in his late 20s. His name is on the actual building now, and he gives enough to the right causes that the city knows who he is. He's handsome in an uncomplicated, confident way. But what always struck me about Brandon, what distinguished him from the men Tiffany usually attracted, was that he was kind. Not performed kindness, not strategic kindness, just a baseline goodness that came through in small ways. He remembered things people told him. He noticed when you were tired. He showed up. He adored Tiffany, completely, openly, without embarrassment. And she chose him, which I once took as evidence that she felt the same. They married 8 years ago on a Saturday in June. I was the maid of honor. I wore a dress the color of seafoam, and I gave a speech that made people cry in the good way, and I meant every word of it. I believed in that marriage. I believed in what those two people could be together. And then, 4 years in, Tiffany had the triplets. Amelia, Cora, and Liam. Born 6 weeks early, 3 at once, in a kind of spectacular chaos that sent the whole family into emergency mode. Brandon hired a night nurse before they were even out of the hospital. My mother moved into their guest room for 2 months. I took a week off work without being asked and drove 3 hours south to help, doing laundry, making grocery runs, holding one baby while Brandon held another, while the night nurse handled the third. I fell in love with those 3 tiny faces the moment I saw them through NICU glass. That love was instant and total, and I have never once doubted it. But something else was also beginning, something quieter, something I wouldn't understand the shape of until much later. Tiffany was changing. I want to be fair to my sister. I want to be careful here because the truth is layered, and I'm not telling this story to make her a villain. I'm telling it because it's mine to tell, and because the truth, all of it, is the only thing I know to offer. Tiffany was a woman whose identity lived on the surface, not in a shallow way. That's not quite right. It was more that she had built her sense of self on things that were visible: her appearance, her social life, her ability to walk into a room and own it. These were genuine skills. She was extraordinarily good at them, and for a long time, those skills brought her everything she wanted. But then she had 3 babies at once, and her body changed in ways that weren't easily photographed, and for 6 months she couldn't travel or host or attend the kind of events where she shone the brightest. And slowly, by degrees that were probably imperceptible to her in the moment, she started to feel like she was disappearing. I can understand that, actually. I can understand it better now than I could then. The problem is what she did with it. By the time the triplets were 18 months old, Tiffany had a new personal trainer, a man named Colton, who wore tank tops and posted motivational content online, and who I thought absolutely nothing of at the time. She had a new wardrobe, which she justified on the grounds that none of her old clothes fit, and she deserved to feel good in her body, which, fair, true, reasonable. She had a new social circle, women she'd connected with at a wellness retreat in Scottsdale, that she talked about with the reverence most people reserve for religious experiences. She started taking solo trips, a long weekend here, a week there. She called it mental health, and look, I believe in mental health. I believe in rest and restoration and taking time for yourself, especially as a mother of 3. I have no argument with any of that in principle. But I noticed things. I noticed that Brandon was always the one staying home with the kids on these trips, always the one rearranging his schedule, canceling his own commitments, moking at work, and he did it without complaint. That was so thoroughly Brandon. But I could see over the course of those months something tightening around his eyes, something he wasn't saying. My mother noticed none of this, or if she did, she chose not to. My mother had decided that Tiffany was a modern, evolved woman who understood her own needs, and that was the story she was going to tell. And I said nothing, because it wasn't my marriage, because I didn't have evidence of anything, because I was still operating on the assumption that I didn't have the full picture, and maybe I was just projecting. Let me tell you where I was in my own life during this period, because it matters. I had spent the previous decade building a career that nobody in my family fully understood or took seriously. When I tried to explain data analytics at Thanksgiving, my mother would say, "Yes, very impressive, Danielle," in the tone she used when something was technically impressive but personally uninteresting to her. My extended family assumed I worked in IT, which is not the same thing, but I stopped correcting them after a while. But the work was real. It was genuinely meaningful to me, and I was genuinely good at it. I'd been promoted twice in 3 years. My client retention rate was the highest on my team. I was building toward something, a partnership track conversation that my director had already started having with me, careful and preliminary, but real. And I bought my house. That craftsman I mentioned, I want to tell you about it because it matters to who I am. I bought it at 29, fixer-upper condition, with a kitchen that still had linoleum from the 1970s and a bathroom that apparently had never been updated ever, and I renovated it myself. Not with my own hands exactly, but with my own decisions, my own budget management, my own vision for what it could be. I stripped that kitchen back to the studs. I chose every tile and every fixture. I planted a garden in the backyard that killed a lot of plants before it finally started thriving. That house is the physical manifestation of everything I built without help, and I love it the way you love things you earned. I was also, during this period, ending a 4-year relationship. His name was Patrick, and I'll keep his story private because it's his to tell. What I'll say is that we were well matched in a lot of ways, and mismatched in the fundamental way that eventually counts. We wanted different futures. He wanted to relocate across the country for a job opportunity. I had just finished renovating my house. We ended things with more grace than most people manage, and I was sad, genuinely sad, but not broken. I had Biscuit, I had my work, I had my house. I had a life that was mine in every important way, and I was okay. And then, in the spring of last year, my mother called me. Tiffany needs help, Danielle. I had been hearing versions of this sentence my entire life. It was so familiar it barely registered as a request anymore. It was more like background noise that occasionally resolves into foreground noise. But then she told me what she meant, and it was not background noise. She's exhausted, truly exhausted, and I think the obvious solution is right in front of all of us if people are willing to be honest about it. I asked her what she meant. She said, "You work from home, you have a flexible schedule, you have a 3-bedroom house that is just you and the dog. It makes every kind of sense for you to step in and be there for those children on a full-time basis while Tiffany gets back on her feet." I said, "Back on